Let me start by saying how Lyme disease became my favorite disease. In 2002, my husband and I went on a week-long vacation with our 2 boys to Martha's Vineyard. And we came back. Our friend said, oh, make sure you check for ticks every day. We did that. We came back to California, and a week later, we got really sick. It was sicker than we'd ever been before. And we went to our primary care doctor, and they said, oh, it looks like you have a virus. We went back another week and said, we feel really, really bad. And they said the same thing. We got bumped from doctor to doctor. Bottom line, it took a year, $60,000, and 10 doctors to get a diagnosis of Lyme disease. We went to the top infectious disease doctor in the area, and he tested us both with the Lyme ELISA, and mine came out positive, my husband's came out negative, and they said, that's a false positive. They fired us as patients, and we were, and they wouldn't give us a referral because they thought we were crazy. They said, we don't have the tools to treat people like you. Another infectious disease doctor said, for you both to get Lyme disease would be like winning the lottery. It's so rare. Another one's diagnosed as, he was the head of his department, it's obvious you have a psychosomatic couples thing. And this is an infectious disease doctor. And so we found a Lyme specialist. And by this time I'm an engineer. I had meticulous spreadsheets. She said, stop. You have Lyme disease. She ran tests. We tested positive for Lyme disease and babesiosis, which is a malaria-like illness that is really endemic on Martha's Vineyard. And anybody who had bothered to Google ticks in Martha's Vineyard would have known that Lyme and that are just, outrageous. So being as an engineer by training, I'm used to analyzing complex problems and finding solutions. As a science writer, I sort of had a basis on, how to explore or dig deep. So I started out, it took 6 years for both Paul and I to get better on and off of antibiotics. And while I was recovering, I decided to do a Lyme disease documentary with a really talented filmmaker in Marin, Andy Wilson. So we embarked on 3.5 years of doing this film. We filmed 350 hours of Lyme experts and patients. And the first time we went to Reston, Virginia to film patients, we said at this conference, it was huge, we said, we want to hear your Lyme stories. Before long, we had a line of 100 people who wanted to tell us their Lyme stories. And every story was tragic, and they were all the same. Doctors weren't taking this disease seriously. People were being misdiagnosed for years, if not decades. And these people were marginalized and spit out of the medical system. So at that point, I said, this is such a human tragedy. And it seems it's an epidemic of a disease, and it's epidemic of ignorance. And, I'm a communicator, and what I can do is maybe fight that epidemic of ignorance. So we also realized it was a really political, polarized epidemic, much like the Republicans and the Democrats, where the sides were no longer talking. And there was a huge divide in what the physicians said the disease was, which was Lyme disease is caused by this little spirochetal bacteria. It's easy to treat, easy to cure with 2 to 4 weeks of antibiotics. And then there was what the patients were experiencing. And, the media only gets information from the New York East Coast academic physicians, the people who publish in JAMA and New England Journal. And they said this, so of course they would believe it. But we had seen with our own eyes the damage and the devastation of the disease. So Andy and I, when I say we, so we put together this documentary. The first thing we noticed is that the establishment, the Centers for Disease Control, the NIH, we would ask them, can you have an expert talk about the epidemic? No, we were stonewalled. I went to one Infectious Diseases Society of America, and Lyle Peterson, who runs the CDC, I said, can I ask you some questions? I'm a journalist. He said, no. Talk to the communications office. I called one of the the people that was there when Willy discovered Lyme disease in Hamilton, Montana. That's Willy Burgdorfer. I'll turn on in a second. And he said, no. You know, when I said, can I interview you about the Lyme disease spirochete? No, and hung up. So the only person, we were desperate to show a balanced view of the disease, and the only person we thought of is Willy Burgdorfer, who discovered Lyme disease in 1982, the bacteria that causes it. So we interviewed him in 2007. Let's see. He was in his late 80s and had advanced Parkinson's, so he was all mentally there. I don't know if you know of anybody who has Parkinson's, but you know, it was hard to understand, and we had to have subtitles. And as we were setting up the cameras, we got a knock on the door of his house in Hamilton, Montana, and it was someone from the labs high up, and he says, I need to sit in on this meeting. And we go, what? And so the director from New Jersey, he's just feisty. He says, no, Willy's a private citizen now. He's retired. Go away. So we interviewed him, and everyone was really on edge and flustered. And Willy, in that interview, gave us the first clue to what would eventually become the book, because he said, you know, the NIH knows that Lyme is permanently disabling. It can be chronic. It can sit dormant in your body for years, if not decades, and blossom again. And he says it's especially damaging to children whose neurological systems are developing. So that was sort of stunning. We did the interview, that's all he said, and when we turned off the camera, he gave a little smile and he said, I didn't tell you everything. But, so, we knew there was more, but we'd been filming for 3 years. We had to get the film out. We were out of money, and so, you know, the film did great. It won 20 documentary awards. It was on the short list for the 2010 Academy Awards. So for a film about disease, it was amazing. And it didn't change that many doctors' minds, but I think it made patients feel like they weren't alone, which was important. And it educated them on the political landscape, in that the first doctor you go to who says you don't have Lyme, and if you feel like you really do, get a second opinion. So that's how it helped. After the film was done and all the marketing afterwards, I told my husband, it was in the spring of 2013, wow, that was quite a journey, and I'm exhausted, and I'm done with Lyme. But then one of my edgy indie filmmaker friends from Traverse City called up and said, I just talked to Willy Burgdorfer. He said Lyme disease is a bioweapon. I go, yeah, right. And so he sent me a video, and it was a almost 4-hour video. He sent it to me. I listened to it all the way through, and he was much sicker then. It was hard to decipher things. I listened to it over and over again, read his body language, and I thought he was telling the truth. But I knew this video, this confession, wouldn't hold up in a court of law. But I'll read some of the things he said, so you can hear it straight from the horse's mouth. So Tim Gray is the filmmaker who was interviewing him. He's a really good interview. He's saying to Willy, let's take your scientific work, studies that I have discovered that were published in 1952 and 56. One being the intentional infecting of ticks, the second being the recombination, that's genetic recombination, of 4 different pathogens, 2 being spirochetal and 2 being viral. From a simple procedural standpoint, I think it's safe to assume the purpose of these studies at the height of the Cold War, on the heels of World War II, was to ensure that we were able to keep up with the rest of the world from a biological weapons standpoint. Did you question that? So Willy paused and replied, question, does Willy Burgdorfer have the potential for biological warfare? As tears welled up in Willy's eyes, he continued, look at the data it already has. If the organism stays within the system, you won't even recognize what it is. In your lifespan, it can explode. We evaluated that. You never deal with that as a scientist. You can sleep better. So then finally, after 3 hours and 14 minutes, Gray asked Willy the one question, the only question he really cared about. Was the pathogen that you found in the tick that Alan Steer found, this is in Lyme, Connecticut, the same pathogen or similar to the one published in the paper from 1952? In response, Willy crossed his arms defensively, took a deep breath, and stared into the camera for 43 seconds, an eternity. Then he looked away, down and to the right. He appeared to be working through an internal debate. The left side of his mouth briefly curled up as if he was thinking, oh well. Then anger flashed on his face. Yeah, he said, more in German than English. So that was really shocking to me. And shortly after that trip, I heard that the Willy Burgdorfer research files that I had requested when the documentary was still in the works had been released to the National Archives. So I went to the National Archives. He was a prolific saver of all pieces of paper that he ever touched in his life and a letter writer. So I went through there and looked through it all with Tim Gray for about 4 days. And the interesting thing is there were no research papers about his biggest discovery, which was the discovery of Lyme disease. There was a big hole, and the only thing that was left there was this mysterious organism that was unnamed. He nicknamed it Swiss agent. So there was a mystery. And I didn't know. I had to go home and start researching. So shortly after that, Willy called up a professor from BYU and said, BYU has a really good archive. There are some papers that I didn't give to the NIH, and I would like to post them to BYU. Would you take them? So Ron Lindorf is the professor, and his whole family had been devastated by Lyme disease. So he drove to Hamilton and loaded up 2 batches of documents that Willy hadn't given to the NIH. And one of them had this sticky note. This is after he died. This batch came in, and it was, I wondered why somebody didn't do something. Then I realized that I'm somebody. So it was almost a confession from the grave. And what it was is his secret experiments on biological weapons. So I'll just go through really the high-level overview of that so you can see what the program entailed. So the biological weapons program, which started at the end of World War II, it was a Manhattan Project for the development of the nuclear bomb. And it had the same rules of secrecy. It was sprawling. It involved every branch of the military. The yellow dots on the back are, Camp Dietrich is the headquarters of biological weapons. It's in Fort Detrick, Maryland, right outside of DC. And Willy, from the time he came to the US in '51, was a consultant to Camp Dietrich. There was also of the CIA within Camp Dietrich, and they were called Special Operations Division. So they did dirty plots like assassinations, the LSD Manchurian Candidate programs. There were no rules. And so Willy helped them. I mean, like one project he worked on for them is they wanted a paralytic agent, and there's a certain tick that has a saliva component that paralyzes you until you take the tick out. So he tried to isolate that. And then the other arms, to the right is Rocky Mountain Lab. That's in Hamilton, Montana. That's where he worked his whole career when he came to the US. And then Plum Island, which is USDA. So the Plum Island did the anti-animal bioweapons research, and Rocky Mountain was sort of like a tick zoo if they needed any kind of ticks for their weapons. Here's Willy, and probably about 52, he's injecting something in ticks. So there were 2 components of the biological weapons program. There was taking live insects and injecting diseases in them. Later on, just isolating the organisms inside the ticks and spraying them, aerosolizing them, spraying them. His first project when he came home to Switzerland was putting plague in fleas. So bubonic plague, which killed a huge percentage of Europe in the 14th century. And so his job to weaponize the insects was figure out how much plague would block the esophagus of the tick so that it would want to feed on a blood meal and regurgitate the plague into the host. So like how many organisms will create that situation? They would deploy the fleas in little bomblets that would reach a certain altitude and spray fleas all over. They did open air tests without the plague with the fleas in Utah many times. So that's a sort of the thing he would work on. Specific challenges. Most scientists in the bioweapons program involved 57 universities, and they wouldn't know what they were doing. They would just give them a... But Willy, since he was birth to Dietrich, he had more of the big picture. This is an experiment he did where he would take really virulent disease agents like tularemia, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, yellow fever, and put them inside ticks, and then see what combinations of ticks and diseases would survive so that they could be dropped on an enemy and wouldn't arouse suspicion, but the native population wouldn't have developed resistance to that particular germ. And then they would, that's how they would feed the ticks on animals to test to see how quickly they died or if they became incapacitated. After a while, the military decided controlling a live insect and the germs inside of them was not very reliable, so they moved to growing the microorganisms in large vats or like beer, stainless steel tanks, then freeze drying them, aerosolizing them, and then spraying them from planes, trains, vehicles, ships. And like from a plane, they did tests with zinc cadmium that showed that those sprays would go 500 square miles. They did some live bacteria tests off San Francisco. That's called the SHAD program, S-H-A-D. You can Google that. And they sprayed Serratium marsens, which is a live bacteria that they thought was harmless, but several people got really sick with urinary tract infections and died at Stanford Hospital. So it wasn't that harmless. The only way an aerosol bacteria or an insect-borne weapon would work is if your people could be vaccinated. So they simultaneously worked on vaccine programs, because then you would spray it on an area. The infrastructure would stay intact, the equipment, the plants, and those people would be alive to tell you, but they would be weakened so you could take it over easily. So this is the 8-ball, which was a 1,000-liter sphere of welded steel, and volunteers would press their face inside the sphere and they would spray microbes or whatever their chemicals, and mostly these were Seventh-day Adventists who volunteered for this duty because they didn't want to go into combat. They were conscientious objectors. So this is the perp that I think has caused a lot of problems of what we have now. This is the Lone Star tick. So in the Northeast, where the original outbreak of Lyme disease, et cetera, started, there was deer ticks. This tick, the Lone Star tick, was mostly just established south of the Mason-Dixon line. But the Army funded this one researcher, university researcher on the coast of Virginia, Norfolk, on the Atlantic bird fly zone to release hundreds of thousands of these ticks. And these ticks are much more aggressive, and they carry more disease or transmit more disease in all stages of their babies. And they're the only ticks in North America that have eye buds on their shoulders, so they can stalk their prey. They don't just, like deer ticks, hang on a piece of grass and wait for you to go by. They stalk and swarm. So this is just shows in Virginia. They would release 1,000 ticks per square. They made them radioactive so they could trace their spread with Geiger counters. And he would do that over 3 years. And the adult ticks, he would paint each one with paint so he could track their spread. But there was no containment. And a year to 2 years later, the Lone Star ticks took over. New York City is in the left-hand corner. This is Long Island. Lyme, Connecticut's right on the mainland at the tip of Long Island. Martha's Vineyard to the right, Nantucket to the right. So 1968, 3 really unusually virulent and new microbes showed up around Long Island. So 1968 through 71, and they're all tick-borne. And it's I mean, any epidemiologist would say up while tick-borne at this time. And this is 2013. You can see the Lone Star has spread all the way to Canada, out towards the west. What I wanted to say about these three diseases. So what are the diseases? Rocky Mountain spotted fever. At that time, Willy Burgdorfer was in charge of rickettsials, which is the kind of bacteria that Rocky Mountain spotted fever was. Rickettsia rickettsii is the most deadly tick-borne disease, and they did experiment with it as one of their lethal weapons. He implied to me that they also used Rickettsia montana as an incapacitating sort of weapon. And so, you know, this incapacitating disease program is it makes you chronically ill but doesn't kill you, and it just sounds a lot like Lyme disease. The other ones were babesiosis. So 1968, that was the first case of babesiosis, which is a malaria-like disease, and it had only been found in cattle before. And all of a sudden it was in humans. And then Lyme arthritis, that was a totally new disease. Okay. So this is rickettsii. It starts 68, huge spike, and it's kept on growing. And then the interesting thing is Willy Burgdorfer, when they were investigating this Lyme arthritis outbreak, his initial findings were, I think that this is a rickettsial epidemic that's making these people sick. And he named that organism, well, he found it tested positive to this European rickettsial called Swiss agent. So I call it Swiss agent USA. And so there were lots of letters between the Yale people and the CDC and the NIH that said, oh, we're so excited. The Lyme epidemic is caused by this rickettsial. After it got to a certain level, everything was quiet, and it was never mentioned again. Even though Willy, in his first drafts of the discovery, had mentioned that it could be a factor, it could be the Lyme disease spirochete and the rickettsial, and it just disappeared forever. And so that's sort of like the mystery that we're left out with. And the book goes into how I tried to trace it. What is the Swiss agent USA? And is it what is making chronic disease in the Lyme patients who have trouble getting better? Because it's an engineered thingy. Let's see. Oh, wait a minute. This is an animation. It just shows the spread. So the first Lyme case was up in Wisconsin. You can see that that's a big outbreak there. And then, of course, the East Coast spread. And you can just see, you know, if you were an arson investigator, you'd say, yeah, it started in the middle of Wisconsin, and it started around Long Island. And this is just a still picture that just shows it's reaching up into Canada, down in the Carolinas. And then the Lyme disease cases continue to grow. So I wanted to talk about what next. So let me just read the last epilogue. I believe that history will judge the tick-borne disease outbreak that began in 1968 as one of the worst public failures of the last century. In the beginning, we were slow to recognize this triple threat. A situation that is now out of control, spreading far and wide, could have been contained with an early intervention of tick control projects and a public education campaign. The myopic focus on only one of the tick diseases, Lyme disease, has led to treatment delays and fatalities in patients with serious mixed infections. Physicians urgently need rapid screening tests and the freedom to use clinical judgment in treating these complex patient cases. I found a witness who dropped ticks infected with some lethal agent on Cuba in 1963 as retaliation for the Bay of Pigs fiasco. They were trying to disable the Cuban sugarcane workers so that Castro would get thrown out. So, you know, I think, you know, why is this relevant now? Because we've focused only on Lyme disease, and sort of the controversy in Lyme disease is the doctors say it's not Lyme disease, and the patients say, but we're still sick. Stop, keep trying to figure out what's wrong. So if there is this bioweapon that's complicating the Lyme disease cases, this could be the unifying theory that explains that. So what I'm hoping the book does is for us to stop obsessing with saying you don't have Lyme and start saying, like a good scientist should say, then what do you have? And let's use modern genomic tools to figure out what's really in the ticks. The United States has not been doing a very good job of tick surveillance, figuring out how far the ticks are spreading and what's in them. And then the academic medical community hasn't been researching, okay, we know what happens when someone has Lyme, more or less, but what happens when you have Lyme with any infections? And then, you know, what I blower or say, okay, military, where this is now of these diseases on our already overtapped healthcare system. It's making people, it's breaking up families, people are losing their jobs, their houses. So tell the military it's time to declassify those documents and tell us where you dropped the ticks, what was in them, where did you spray the tick-borne diseases, because that will save decades of research of like running expensive genomic studies, trying to figure out what are the diseases, what was genetically combined, and then we can figure out how to treat them. So that's what I'm hoping. Now I'll take questions.